My name is Bryan Mulcahy, and I'm with the Fort Myers Regional Library. You have my email address at the bottom there. If during the course of the program, if you run into any questions that you forget to ask, if you send me an email, I'll be more than happy to answer your questions via email at any time. So we will get started here. The listing of study guides that I have here, they are all on the Allen County Library website. I've included the years when I updated these. The primary one for today's session is going to be number 6, obviously inaccurate and misleading genealogical records, citations, and sources. But all of these other study guides that I have on here are going to give you information that would be related to the topic we're talking about today, especially to the two that a lot of people find the most popular of all of these would be number 2, the common genealogy research mistakes, and also the one determining the reliability of genealogical records and documents. Now, as far as research is concerned, you have to face up to some realities. Number 1, sources are going to contain errors and omissions, and this even includes the most authoritative print and online sources. You have to look for error. Sometimes these errors may be accidental, as in spelling errors or misinterpreted words, or errors that are intentional, as in dates and ages. Research material without source documentation should never be trusted. You would call that hearsay versus genealogy. You should look at every source with a critical eye, no matter how reliable you believe it to be. AKA, you should be a detective. Even if a source does contain some errors, don't ignore it. Compare it to more sources closer to the event. Trusting only one source or focusing only on items that fit your assumptions or expectations may lead to errors, misinterpretation, and/or faulty conclusions. And this would also include eyewitness accounts found in official records. You should always question the reliability of the informant in testimony, and the informant is always going to be the key to the accuracy of the information. There are 3 important genealogical definitions that you really need to be aware of. Evidence constitutes facts used to reach conclusions about genealogical data, relationships, or events that are found in your research sources. You also have the genealogical proof standard. These are suggested guidelines a genealogist should follow for their work to be considered credible, and it's generally composed of 5 elements. Number 1, a reasonably exhaustive research project has been conducted. Each statement of fact has a complete and accurate, emphasis on the word accurate, source citation. All evidence is reliable and has been properly correlated and interpreted. All contradictory issues have been resolved. The conclusion has been soundly reasoned and coherently written. Now, there is one caveat. Any proof statement is subject to being re-examined when new evidence arises. This next slide talks about the different types of evidence. Direct evidence, this refers to the source of information. Example, if the birth information came from a birth certificate, then it would be direct evidence. Indirect evidence, this is information that requires corroboration. It provides enough detail to enable you to form a hypothesis, and when combined with other evidence, will allow you to reach a reasonably reliable conclusion. An example of this, there are 3 of them. You can't find a birth certificate for your grandfather, but you can determine an age using a census and/or a birth announcement. The census doesn't give his exact date of birth. The birth announcement gives a birth date. His full name is not provided, but his parents' names are cited. By using both indirect records, you can reach a reasonable conclusion as to his probable date of birth. Now, negative evidence seems to be something that confuses a lot of people. These are conclusions about relationships or facts that are drawn because a situation fails to exist when it probably should. So 3 examples of this that I run into a lot. A young child is not listed with the family on a census. Living individual is not named in the will of a supposed parent when all the other children are. Finally, a surviving spouse is not listed in the will or obituary. When it comes to the concept of proof, it's a 4-step process. Number 1, the reliability of sources must always be established. Number 2, the statements made by family members, associates, and neighbors cannot always be taken at face value for a variety of reasons. Number 3, official records often contain a variety of errors. One big example, multiple spellings of a name in the same record. Finally, there are 3 keys to successful research. Number 1, knowing the intended purpose of the record. Now, one of the screenshots later on is a book that Corey Meyerink with Brigham Young University wrote in 1998, and it basically is a book that's kind of like the genealogy of a resource. You need to know, make sure that when you're looking at a record, who was the record created for, as in the entity, and who, whether it be the police or some agency, something like that. Number 2, the ability to identify and understand the information and determine its accuracy given the circumstances and historical context. And as I said, there'll be 3 excellent sources that I'm going to be showing you in an upcoming slide. Now, the most common errors that you're going to find and what their circumstances would be. There are numerous potential scenarios and variations involving errors, but these are the most common. As I said earlier, accidental. These errors may have been caused by speaking, hearing, reading, writing, or memory lapses. Number 2, the intentional. Now, for some people, this may sound a little funny, but it is what it is. The informant deliberately provided false information and/or omitted important details. Some of the most common examples would include the intent was to hide information that was perceived to be offensive and/or the desire to paint a negative portrait of the person or family. This tends to be, for a lot of people, the number 1 scenario. Another one would be the possibility of personal, financial, or social gain or advancement that influences the informant to provide false or distorted views of an event or situation. Another one, the informant will deliberately exaggerate or embellish the story or account to make themselves look better or impress a listener or reader. Another one would be, rather than admit ignorance of people or events, the informant and/or family members will invent or distort information about people and events. Now, an example of number 2, sometimes I've found it when helping people with census records. Theoretically, the census takers, if a family wasn't home, they were supposed to go back and try to interview the people in the family. Sometimes the information, a lot of times, was given by a neighbor. If that neighbor was an honest person, you never would normally have a problem. If that neighbor had a grudge against that person, they often would take the opportunity to say, for lack of a better term, the politest way I can put it is they said some very nasty things about the particular person, and their intent hopefully was to get them in trouble. That is something that will happen. Another one, researchers can create errors by misreading or misunderstanding accurate sources or applying them to the wrong people. Using the internet versus taking the time to compare information with other primary or secondary sources fosters this spreading of errors and misinformation. Now, errors and misinformation can lead to some significant research challenges. Some of the most common discrepancies that patrons will run into would include baptismal, christening, and presentations in the church containing the wrong birth dates, names, and sex. Another one, birth records with incorrect proper names and surnames. Another one would be death records with incorrect names for the decedent, parents, and places of residence. Another one would be family Bible entries with fabricated information. Now, when it comes to family Bibles, generally speaking, the information in them tends to be more accurate than what you're going to find in a lot of civil records. But there is one thing that you should be aware of with family Bibles. Look at the date of publication. If a family Bible was, let's say, came from the late 1700s, and all of the entries in there follow the pattern from that time forward, sometimes the handwriting will be a little different as people died and others took up the recording. Those tend to be more accurate than the other example. Let's say it was the family Bible is from the 1860s, but it has information going back to the 1700s. That information from the past was added after the fact, so that may or may not be totally accurate. Just something to bear in mind. Marriage license applications with incorrect names of the bride or groom's father or mother. Tax rolls listing a dead man as a living taxpayer. Military records that are omitting a soldier. Wills and probate packets omitting the names of children and falsely identifying bogus heirs. And finally, deed and land records that contain incomplete or bogus land descriptions and or incorrect names of the owner. Now, I'm sure some of you can come up with some I didn't even put on there. Now, in terms of guidelines for evidence and analysis, a lot of this I would say is common sense, but I still cover it anyway. Direct evidence is always going to be easier to understand, but indirect evidence can carry equal weight. That's one reason why you have to check your sources. Reliable genealogical conclusions are based on the weight, not the quantity of information found. Again, I'll repeat that. Reliable genealogical conclusions are based on the weight, not the quantity of the evidence that's found. Evidence should be drawn from a variety of independently created sources. Original source material will generally be more reliable than derivative material. The reliability of derivative work can be influenced by how often it has been reproduced in various formats. And you remember I said earlier that sadly, if people don't take the time to really do some research and they just take off what they see on the internet and assume it's correct, the errors keep being spread over and over and over again. Most reliable informants have first-hand knowledge of the events to which they testify. Handwriting analysis can help establish identity, date, and authenticity. Microfilm, scans, and photocopies are usually more accurate than handwritten or typed transcriptions and abstracts. Readable photographs of tombstone inscriptions are more accurate than handwritten notes. Transcriptions made closer to the time of the event tend to be more accurate than those made years or decades afterwards. And finally, something you need to always remember, when it comes to genealogical research, the case is never absolutely positively closed. Now, some strategies that have a proven track record for success for uncovering some of these errors. This section is going to cover that. Most errors are uncovered by taking the time to compare and contrast independent sources that provide evidence, answering the same research questions, and the steps that I am going to talk about now are considered critical in this analysis process. Number one, view any uncorroborated records or testimony with skepticism. No matter how much you may think the person is telling the truth, if they don't have something to back it up, you need to be careful. Number two, search broadly for independent sources that might provide corroboration. Number three, verify the independence of these sources, accounts, or testimonies. Number four, reject information that cannot be corroborated. You should still try to analyze it, but if you cannot corroborate it, for the most part, you should reject it, although I wouldn't throw it away completely, because later on, as you go forward in the research process, you may later find some information that might corroborate it. Number five, thoroughly examine the research subject's records dating back from birth to death, looking for repetition, patterns, or sequences. Use a variety of formats to compare and contrast seemingly relevant information. The most popular used by experts in the field include the following: language and writing used by the subject in daily activities. Number two, timelines of events relevant to the event or subject. Timelines are your friend, and taking the time to do a timeline will often identify areas that you need to look at. I have run into some genealogists over 34 plus years that they thought they had all of their stuff ready to go until they heard me or someone else suggest, why don't you check it with a timeline? When they did that, they found out that they had some very serious flaws in what they had there. Number three, maps and plats. Number four, tables and spreadsheets. Now, this section, I'm going to talk about evidence analysis questions, and the screenshot there, one of our former volunteers for many years, Jenna Hamister, she was with the West, I don't know if she's still alive or not, but she was a wonderful lady. But every time she did a class, on the front of the podium, she would have genealogy without documentation is mythology. Well, on this one, they say the definition of mythology, genealogy without documentation. First one, do the facts refer to the correct individual or family of interest? Some things you have to be aware of with this. There are no hard and fast rules for determining accuracy. Finding multiple people with the same name and from the same locality is common. Names were reused. If children died at childbirth, the names were reused later on. Use known facts and information to more or less separate contenders with the same name. Some of the most common that often help would be the place of birth, the level of education, their occupation, their level of income, the race, religious affiliation, and did they have any land or property holdings. Another one, as I said earlier, this may sound like a broken record, but timelines listing the major events in the lifetime of an individual or family often uncovers inconsistencies. Back in the 1840s, there was no way, or early 1850s, there was no way you were going to get from New York to, let's say, California in 3 days. I don't care unless they were in a spaceship, whatever. Another one, educated guesses are a legitimate option in genealogical and historical research with one caveat. Over time, new facts may be uncovered that might provide more information. The second question, do the facts accurately reflect the circumstances or issues? This is challenging because secondhand accounts are more often the norm that you're going to have to deal with. A simple or straightforward yes or no answers to a particular question or situation seldom exist. The accuracy is always going to be dependent on the informant's knowledge and their motivations. Number 4, has the scenario or information changed over time? I'll give you a simple thing that pertains to me. Over the years, I was born December the 14th, 1953 at 12:07 a.m. But over the years, my mother's description of the night I was born has changed. At one point, she said I was born in a whiteout. They couldn't get me out of the house they lived in, so I was born there. Another time, she told me I was born in a taxi cab. Finally, I did find a little card from Passavant Memorial Hospital. It's on the campus of Northwestern University that basically said I was born in the hospital, like I said, December the 14th, 1953 at 12:07 a.m. Over the years, that's an example of all the versions of what I heard. Next one, have you taken the time to read a history or newspaper account of the area during the time period in question? That's something you should take the time to do, even if it delays your research a little bit. Getting back to the other one previously, there was one other scenario. Supposedly that night there was a blizzard in Chicago. Well, I checked the weather report for December the 14th, and it was cold that night, but there was no blizzard. Okay, next one. Be careful about judgments based on modern standards and circumstances. The historical context is going to be something you need to be careful about. You can't judge the past by today's standards. If you're going to be doing research, you have to know what the historical context was at that time period, because that's the way it was. The next one, do the facts accurately apply to the historical circumstances, aka historical context, that existed during the period? Now, when you're trying to determine the answer to this question, some of the best sources for you to look at are ethnic histories, county and town histories, timelines, newspapers, family Bibles, family correspondence, diaries, journals, and photograph albums, military and regimental histories, historical maps and gazetteers, and family interviews, which sometimes would also be known as oral histories. Finally, was the informant's knowledge reliable? Some things to consider: the reputation of the informant and what their relationship was to the person. Do they have a history of being truthful, or have they been known to play fast and loose with the truth on occasions? This is applicable to any type of information. Some of the criteria that would be used for evaluation: was the informant in a position to have reliable information? Would they benefit by giving false or misleading information? And as I said earlier, has the informant provided reliable information in the past? Now, these are 3 books that we have in the Fort Myers genealogy collection, and I'm going to assume they have them in Allen County Library, and most major libraries would have them. The first 2 are by Elizabeth Schoen Mills, Evidence Explained. This one is considered the Bible for showing you not only how to determine the accuracy of evidence, but it also shows you how things are cited. The earlier book she did, Evidence, Citation, and Analysis for the Family Historian, this was sort of an earlier version of the later version that we have that's on my left. And the book I told you earlier that Corey Meyerink did on printed sources, this is a book that, as I said earlier, will essentially give you what I would call the genealogy of a record, so you can determine, is this record really something that I should be looking at, and does it have the information, and was it created for the circumstances that I'm researching? All 3 of them are excellent books. Even though the Meyerink book was done, I believe, in 1997 or 1998, it is still considered very relevant by most professionals. Now, these sources that are listed below, these are considered some of the most relevant sources to search for if you're going to be looking to locate what I would call potential inaccuracies or verifying the accuracy of records. They all pretty much speak for themselves. The religious affiliation can be very interesting simply because when a lot of people came over, no matter what religious affiliation they were, if they moved to a certain area, they often would adopt the religion that was most predominant in that particular area. But all of these are things that you need to keep in mind when you're analyzing this type of information. Now, these are some what I would call final evidence reminders. I got them off of Legacy Family Tree Genealogists, and all of these would be relevant. Actually, let me go back a slide. I got ahead of myself. On these particular sources, when you're talking about age, okay, census records, cemetery records, family Bibles, military records, obituaries, pension applications, tax records, and vital records would give you that type of information. If you're talking about birth dates and places, cemetery records, again, census and church records, family Bibles, military records, newspapers, birth announcements, obituaries, and vital records. When you're talking about the city or parish, including if they're foreign-born, census records, church records and family Bibles, family histories, immigration records, naturalization and citizenship papers, obituaries, and vital records. If you're talking about country origins, boundaries, and place-finding aids, you'd be looking at atlases, city directories, crisscross directories, county or family histories and gazetteers, land and property records, taxation maps, and records. Obviously, if you're talking about death records, it's cemeteries, church records, court records, family Bibles, land and property records, military records, newspapers, obituaries, probate records, and vital records. If you're talking about divorces, court records, divorce records, newspapers, and vital records. If you're talking about ethnicity, census records, church records, family Bibles, immigration records, membership in minority associations or societies, and naturalization and citizenship papers. If you're looking for the immigration or immigration date, again, a lot of these are going to be very similar: census, church history or records, family Bibles, published family history books or family history articles in periodicals, an immigration record, naturalization and citizenship papers, newspapers, and obituaries. For marriage and maiden names, biographies, censuses, cemeteries, church records, and family Bibles, family histories, land and property records, the military, newspapers, nobility listings, personal correspondence, probate records, school records, and vital records. For occupations, you'd be talking about business directories that list company officials and employees, the censuses, city directories, the crisscross, civil registration, court records, immigration, military, newspapers, obituaries, and probate records. For parents, children, and other family members, most of these are exactly the same, but you also have biographies, land and property records, the naturalization and citizenship papers. So goes on and on. Now this is off of Family Tree, Legacy Family Tree Genealogists, and you see the website there where I got this screenshot, but this is going to be talking about the researcher's interpretation of pertinent information and sources. And as I said earlier, the third one there on negative, this sometimes seems to cause a lot of confusion with people. And again, I'll say that the conclusion, it's based on a relationship or fact that should be present, but it isn't there. And this is another one that talks about the differences between primary, secondary, and undetermined. When it's undetermined, there was inadequate data that was provided to actually identify the informant. Now, even if this information right now initially would be considered undetermined, or you're not sure what's going on, never get rid of it, because as you go through the research process, you may find more information that will give you the answer to the question that you're looking for. Now, some relevant websites for follow-up consultation. Ancestral Findings. This is one that has a very proven track record. In this particular case, they actually had a brief presentation on there about using negative evidence to prove family relationships. It includes not only a YouTube article, but it has the link to the presentation. Now, I'm sure most of you have used Cindy's List. That is considered one of the best sites to find the most reliable genealogical records on the internet. And this particular one is one that discusses evidence analysis and evaluation. And all of these links that you see on the right and the left, these are all categories that you can go to for additional research. She even has a section on here for evidence and analysis. These are actual articles. Now, this is just the top of the page. If you went further down, you would find a lot more articles that would be of interest. Actually, I did another screenshot. Has the Board of Certification of Genealogists, the DAR Library, Evidence Analysis by Tristan Tolman, Evidence Explained. This is a quick lesson that Elizabeth Schoen Mills actually has available on Cindy's list. And there are some more. I tried to give you as much as I could so you get some idea how valuable Cindy's list can be. Now, this is one off of the Family Search blog. The author of this was Tyler Staley. I hope I didn't butcher that name too much, but this is one where he discusses in detail understanding the genealogical proof standard. I gave you a basic gist of this, but this one will go into a lot more detail. This is Family Search Wiki. The Family Search Wiki is one of the best places to go to, and this is their article on the genealogical proof standard. Again, it goes into a great deal of detail about this particular topic. My study guide on evidence analysis, it's never going to be as good as what they have, but it will give you a lot of information that you'll need to help you as you progress through the research process. And then this is another article on Family Search Wiki, and this particular one, the previous article talked about the genealogical proof standard. This article goes into detail about how to put it in action. This is another website, again, Legacy Family Tree Genealogists. They definitely have an excellent record for putting people in success, and they also will help you with your research. But this is one talking about evidence analysis, digging into the genealogical sources. This will sort of tell you what you should be looking for when you're not only using these sources, but perhaps evaluating whether the sources are completely and totally accurate. Now, as far as final thoughts for review, I'll just simply, these are some things that I think you should remember. Historical interpretations are going to change over time. And at the risk, again, of sounding like a broken record, historical context is the key to your success, and that is what you have to go by. There's nothing wrong with being politically correct. I'll leave that up to individuals, how they feel about that. But when you're doing genealogy, political correctness does not matter. Historical context is what you have to go by. Number two, and this fits in with what I just said, 21st century norms, unfortunately, are irrelevant to historical circumstances. What happened in the past happened. Some of it is good, some of it is not so good. Most of the people I deal with, they realize that, and that's something they accept and they go on. Bottom line is, even some of the things that happened that were not very good, most people I deal with, regardless of what race they are or what ethnic group they are in, they enjoy going through the process, and they just take what happened as it is and they go on. Number three, stretching the truth may happen, as in liberties taken in family stories and traditions. Number four, be careful about perceptions regarding the family black sheep. I actually have a study guide on black sheep, and I've done multiple presentations about black sheep ancestors. If any of you are interested in both of those, you can let me know. But one of the things you need to remember about the black sheep, sometimes it's the black sheep that are telling the truth, and the family has engaged in, let's just say, creative history. Number five, stonewallers, deliberate deceptions are going to happen, and there are some people that are so determined to try to hide the past that they will go to great lengths to feed you with misinformation. Number six, you might as well accept the fact that you are going to find contradictions in records. You need to remember that historically, when people were on the frontier going back in time, the main thing that they were concerned with was survival. They didn't always know the facts, and sometimes the facts would change over time. And to some degree, again, this may sound funny, but it has been proven over and over again that if the information was provided by a male in the family, I'll just say that sometimes the males were the worst people to ask about the facts about a family. I remember one lady saying that the grandfather, they had so many children, he actually referred to the kids by numbers. It was only when the wife gave the information that the names came out. He couldn't even remember their names. I'll leave it at that. I'll stay out of that one. Number 7, investigate any unexplained family heirlooms, pictures, and diaries. Sometimes, if you can do some research into that, it may help you overcome some brick walls that you've discovered. Number 8, again, I gave you a couple examples of this from my own situation, but stories, accounts, dates, places, or narratives often change over time or become hazy over time. I'm sure some of you have heard, I believe the term is the rose-colored glass syndrome, that when sometimes people talk about the past, all they remember are the good things. They don't always remember some of the not so good things. Have to keep that in mind. Number 9, keep an open mind and again remember historical context. And finally, the case is never closed on any genealogical conclusion. Okay, I'm ready if there are any questions out there. I
Thank
hope I
you.
covered everything.
Thanks. We do have a couple questions for you, so we can get into those. The first one is someone's asking, what do you do when you find the wrong information on your ancestors on a family tree? They say somebody has added a person to their tree that they know is not accurate, so they're wondering what to do in that situation.
Okay, if you email me, I have a study guide that talks about a genealogy software program. If you use Family Search, Ancestry, MyHeritage, all of these other sites that offer free that you can input information in, it's fine and dandy if you use them. But the role that a lot of these sites have is their goal is to create a one world tree. If you take the time to invest in a genealogy software program, you will still be able to do searching on these databases. The difference is when you do your findings, you can put them into your genealogy software program. What does that mean? You will remain the boss of your information. Nobody can go in and change your information. You can share your pictures with whoever you want to share them with. You can share your information with whoever you want to share it with. And the bottom line is, if I have to put it in a nutshell, you are the boss of your information. If you use these other databases and all that, it's fine if you do it. But if Kara Weidlich were still here, she was the former president of the Lee County Genealogy Society. If Jenna was still around, if Carolyn Ford was still around, all three of them could give a complete and total lecture on why you should not go that route. You should instead put your information on a genealogy software program, and my guide will give you some of the major companies, and they all encourage you to go to their sites and do a sample entry to see what it would look like if you use their product. If you put your information on these other sites, if the day comes when you want to publish your information There's no guarantee that you're going to be able to do that because theoretically they own the copyright. That's one reason I tell people whenever they say they're going to do it, before you do that, you need to look at the policies and procedures about what will happen if you ever decide to publish your information.
Good deal. Thank you. For our next one, somebody's asking, what is considered a crisscross directory?
A crisscross directory is it's basically another name for a city directory, which these are similar in some ways to telephone books. They are usually more reliable than telephone directories, but they're similar. I actually have a study guide that would tell you what a city directory would be and what some of the differences are between telephone directories, but I haven't used a telephone directory in, I think, about 6 or 7 years. But we do get more people looking at the city directories anymore now. They don't even ask about telephone directories anymore.
Thank you. So I see a question that is asking if you can get a copy of the chat for the presentation, and you can. So just wanted to mention, for a copy of the chat, or if anybody has any additional questions, you can email us at genealogy@acpl.info. And it looks like we have one more question, and they're wondering if you could talk a little bit about the accuracy of county histories and biographical sketches.
Okay, that is a very, very, very interesting question. Okay, let me add one thing to it. If you want to know the most accurate history of a locality, before I answer that question, most experts would say you should take the time to read the newspaper, because the newspaper often has more accurate information. County histories are fine. They serve a good purpose and they have a lot of good information in them, including historical maps, symbols that would help you identify churches, cemeteries, major entities in a place. But the thing you have to remember about county histories is that sometimes they were somewhat sanitized, for lack of a better term. They might mention events, they would mention a lot of events that happened in a particular area, but sometimes they may or may not have included information about incidents or accidents or things like that that were not so nice to deal with. Another thing, when you're looking at the profiles in some of these county histories, be aware of the fact that some people paid top dollar, for lack of a better term. They paid top dollar to make sure the author put in what they wanted them to put in for their biographical profile. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Or
that
as,
is helpful.
or as one person said, if you've got the money, I've got the time to make you look like you were the greatest person that ever lived in this county. Now, as far as biographical sketches, are you talking about in published biographies?
I believe that's what they were referring to.
Okay, I would say on the whole that they would tend to be more accurate. But there are plenty of people that will use both. I'm not trying to put anybody down that wrote a county history. The older county histories, they have a lot of good information in them. And in some cases, you may find something in them that you're not going to find in other sources.
And thank you for a great presentation and for your time today. And I just wanted to mention again, for anyone that would like a copy of the chat, please send us an email at genealogy@acpl.info.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, but you think of any, you know where to find me.
All right, thanks.
All right,
Bye-bye.
have a good day. Thank you
You
all for
too.
coming. Bye-bye.